next month, back here, first Wednesday of the month, we are going to be hearing from Powell and Mary Carius from the Wetland Evaluation Program, and they're going to be talking about that program and citizen science, and we might also get to hear from someone at the PCA who's also involved with that program, so that should be good. And with that, we are extremely pleased to have Lemm with Bowser and Doug Norris from the DNR here to speak with us today and kick off the WCA Forum season. They will be providing us with updates on several aspects of wetland regulation and wetland programs in Minnesota. We are pleased to see that all of you are back here after the season. And with that, Lemm, who is the wetland section manager, has been with Bowser shaping wetland policy for many years. He previously was district manager for Lemm Wood Soil and Water Conservation District. He earned a master's degree in resource economics from North Dakota State University and a bachelor's degree in natural resource management from the University of Minnesota. Doug Norris is the wetland program coordinator with Minnesota DNR. In recent years has spearheaded a successful statewide wetland monitoring program. In 2013, Doug was among 7 people nationwide to win the National Wetlands Award for state, tribal, and local program development, and has been actively involved in wetland protection and conservation for over 20 years. So thank you so much for both of you being here.
I think the order we're going to go in is probably the 404 assumption study first. That's the one that's going to take the longest and maybe have the most discussion. Then we'll get into an update of the status of the local government roads wetland replacement program, new fee policy that Bowser's working on, and the last thing will be rulemaking, because there's not a lot of new stuff that's happened since the last time we were here with rulemaking. So we won't spend a whole lot of time on that, and like I say, that'll be towards the end here. So Doug's the lead. This 404 assumption study that will Doug do most of the talking here. I'll chime in, but he's the lead on the study. Yeah, exactly. So he will lead the talk.
Okay, good. All right, thanks, Les. Can you hear me okay if I stand out here? Hear me in the back, okay? Okay. So first of all, I have to apologize. There's really no way to make this very exciting. There's no car chases. There's no explosions. It's just some slides about wetlands policy. So you'll have to bear with me there. But ask some questions as we go through this. Let you know if you've got questions or you just want to discuss something. We can do that as we go through the slides. I think we have time to go through. We don't need to wait till the end. So I'm going to wait through this 404 assumption stuff, and then Les will get on with some of the WAC and rulemaking and so forth.
And I would say that for everything. Let's have a discussion, questions as we go here. Not only the 404 assumption, but when we get to the next things too. So I think we have times.
Okay, so just a little bit of background. In 2015, the legislature passed a law that required Bowser and DNR to jointly do a study of the feasibility of assuming the Section 404 program under the Clean Water Act. This law was largely generated due to pressure from particularly county highway engineers who were very concerned about the amount of time that it was taking them to get permits from the Corps. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So as the legislature tends to do, they said, okay, well, we'll do a study. And so they put Bowser and DNR in charge of doing a study of feasibility of Section 404. I wanted to just briefly explain about 404 assumption, because I think sometimes people have maybe a little confused perception of what it is. Under Section 404 assumption, and I apologize if you already know all this, but under Section 404 assumption, the way that it works is that a state has a state regulatory program or programs. And the EPA will review those programs and determine whether or not they satisfy the requirements of Section 404. If they make that determination, then the state can assume the Section 404 program. So a project that requires a wetlands permit gets its state permit, and by virtue of that, it is also then authorized under Section 404. There are no more Section 404 permits with some exceptions, which we'll talk about. But in general, the way that it works under assumption is that you get your state permit under the state regulatory program, and that basically confers Section 404 authority. So no more Section 404 permits. Instead of having to get both a state and a federal permit, you would only get a state permit for most projects. So I just want to make sure people are kind of familiar with that, because some people seem to think that, well, the state takes over Section 404 and then we issue Section 404 permits. That's not how that works. We issue a state permit that has 404 authority behind it. So.
Maybe notice here too, you see it talks about Bowser and the commissioner of DNR, and we've got Bowser and the commissioner. We also have the PCA's logo, just because, you know, even though Bowser and DNR were directed to complete the study, PCA does have a significant role in, you know, wetland regulation / protection in Minnesota, both with water quality rules as well as 401 certification for certain 404 permits. So we've been involving PCA throughout the development of the study. We're working on the report missions.
So just a little bit more background here. This is the kind of the process we've been using. We have a project management team that involves people from Bowser, and Les is on it. We have somebody from PCA, another couple people from DNR, and then we've also been including representatives from the Corps of Engineers, and I will point out that they have been maintaining a very neutral stance about all this. They're neither for nor against the state assuming Section 404, although it does obviously have some implications for them. And then we've also been including EPA Region 5 representative, Carrie Ann Weaver, is more or less on our project team. So they kind of, we're the folks who have been doing all of the sort of heavy lifting in terms of preparing the report. We then have a stakeholder group. We have kind of a core group, the core feasibility study group, that was selected from sort of associations that represent particular sectors. So we have business sector, ag sector, environmental conservation sectors, and that they all are part of this about 15-member core feasibility study group, and that's the main group that does the discussion with us when we have stakeholder meetings. We also have then just a whole list of general stakeholder contacts, and there's probably about 100 people on that list, and many of them come to the meetings, and you know, they can provide input and so forth. The project or the report is going to have to go through the Bowser board to be you know, approved by them before it goes to the legislature. Same thing with the DNR Commissioner's Office. And the timeline is that it's due next January. So we've been working on this for about a year and a half. We have now prepared drafts of all of the chapters. Nearly all of them have been sent out to the stakeholders, the core group, for review. And we're in the process of getting input from them. We have a stakeholder meeting coming up this coming Monday to get input from them. We will then revise the report based on the input that we get, prepare probably a final draft, give people one last chance to look at it, and then it will go through that Bowser and DNR Commissioner approval process and hopefully be ready to submit to the legislature in January. So that's kind of where we're at. What I'm going to do today is walk you through the pieces of the legislation. The law itself specified specific things that needed to be addressed in the study, certain study elements. And I'm going to walk you through each one of those and talk about the findings, kind of the major findings that we have made so far for each of those elements. And some are more significant than others. And as I said, feel free to ask questions as we go through this. That will help move things along there. So the first study element that the law required us to do was just identify what are the federal requirements for state assumption. And these are just some of the major topics there. First of all, the state has to have comprehensive jurisdiction. We have to have jurisdiction over all the waters and wetlands that are covered by the Clean Water Act, which, as most of you probably know, is a little bit up in the air right now, which makes things a little difficult for us. But Then we also have to have regulatory jurisdiction over all activities that would be covered by the Clean Water Act. So basically that's the discharge of dredged and fill material. Now in Minnesota we actually regulate beyond that. We regulate draining and filling, excavation for the most part. But those are the things that the state must do in order to assume the program.
You know, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind, I think when we talk about for assumption a lot, even when we talk about it, you know, we're talking about it in terms of wetlands in many cases, but it's really more than that. You know, it's just we have so many wetlands in Minnesota, and that's, you know, where we have probably the most activity and dealing with the most projects. But it's not just wetlands, it's other waters. So the wetlands, as we'll get to, I think, in a little bit here, you know, we have pretty good jurisdiction as far as the, you know, geographic jurisdiction. It's you know, but there are some other instances of other types of waters that we don't. So.
The federal regulations require that the state program be at least as stringent. That's the word that they use. At least as stringent in terms of you know, resource protection as the Clean Water Act Section 404 program. So we're going to talk about kind of how our programs stack up against that. This is a big one, is that the state programs, if you're going to assume Section 404, the state regulatory programs must be administered by a state agency. Now, as you all know, Wetland Conservation Act is generally administered by local governments. And that's a big point for us under assumption, and we'll talk some more about that in a little bit. There are some public notice requirements that are somewhat different than what we have right now. And then under 404 assumption, the EPA has the right to review all state permits that are issued. Now, in practice, they can waive their review for whatever they want to. And in Michigan, where they have assumed the program many, many years ago, the EPA only reviews about 2% of the permits that the state issues. It's permits that are over a certain size threshold. So they would probably do something similar for us, but they do have the right to review every state permit, and they provide oversight. When a state assumes the Section 404 program, the EPA has oversight over the state program, and they can review permits and all the programmatic things that go into that. So those are the federal requirements. That's the first thing that's outlined in the report. The second study element deals with the potential extent of assumption, okay, including waters that have to remain under the jurisdiction of the Corps. By law, the Corps has to retain jurisdiction over navigable waters, truly navigable waters, and the wetlands that are adjacent to them.
Certain navigable waters.
Certain navigable waters. So there are some big questions about what this means right now, and so Les is on a national committee headed by EPA to talk about this, so I'm going to let Les weigh in on this piece.
Yeah, it's definitely not clear, and there's been a lot of disagreement among or between states and the Corps, and very little, actually no guidance from EPA on the issue. So that's why EPA formed this committee. It's the Assumable Waters Subcommittee of the National. It's a long name, so it's another apparent committee, I guess, for natural resources, environmental policy, and technology.
So it's not just Section 10 waters, it's
As far as what can be, it's less than clear. So this committee that I'm on is charged with trying to provide recommendations to EPA on how to clarify that. So a little bit of history with this. The ability for states to assume the 404 program came into being or came into law in 1977 with amendments to the Clean Water Act. Actually, specifically Section 404G1 that talks about the extent of assumption. So certain waters can be assumed by the state, other waters have to be retained by the Corps for the purposes of administering 404. If you look at the long history leading up to it, including the congressional history, you know, to me and to most of us, it looks like essentially it's Section 10 waters minus those that are a Section 10 water only for historical use. And there's a lot of complications here. I won't get too far into the details. So it's not exactly Section 10 waters. It's a different or subset of the list of Section 10 waters. But even that, it's not perfectly clear, and there's a lot of complications with that and some disagreements on what I just said as well. But then the next part, and I think which is even the bigger piece and the more important part for Minnesota, is and adjacent wetlands. Well, the term adjacent didn't, in 1977, and even before that, the time leading up to 77, when these amendments were being actually first considered, and they were actually first proposed for a different purpose, and they got changed to be used as a way to allow states to assume the program with the accept of these waters. And so there's a long history. In that whole time period, the term adjacent had a very different important level of importance that it does now, and wasn't really thought of in the same meaning as it is thought of now as it's used to determine jurisdiction. So that causes some complications, because if you were to take all adjacent wetlands, for example, let's just assume that Upper and Lower Red Lake were in non-assumable waters. So first you have to determine which waters are assumable or which are retained by the Corps. So if we assume that Upper and Lower Red Lake are assumable or are retained by the Corps, the adjacent wetlands go for literally over 100 miles. And they even go farther than this, but with the GIS exercise, we had to essentially just stop, because every time you get to a road, you have to stop and manually break that, because the road breaks the wetland polygon, but it doesn't mean that the wetland isn't, quote, adjacent. So we had to go and manually fix them, and it expands. And we finally, figured this makes the point. We gave up. So that's one of the issues that we're dealing with too, is how do we define which adjacent wetlands are assumable versus which have to be retained by the Corps and they're adjacent to a retained water. So it gets very complicated. Now, if you dig deep into the congressional record, the author of the bill, in response to a question, is what does this mean? What does adjacent mean? He said, immediately contiguous. Oh, that sure helps, I mean, I think, obviously to most of us that hear that, and if you read some of the background, they're talking about, yes, they're really close. They don't go for 100 miles. But where? So which wetlands? Where do we draw the line? Where do we base that on? So it gets into a really big discussion and an argument, and there's all kinds of room for disagreement. So that leads to then the process for determining which wetlands are retained by the Corps versus which ones are assumed for program implementation by the state. That process, to determine those, they are developed or identified as part of developing a memorandum of agreement between the state and the Corps. And that memorandum of agreement becomes part of the application to the Corps, or to the EPA, for program assumption. So all of this stuff has to be figured out between the state and the Corps, and there's no process to deal with disagreements. So
how are you wrapping in the redefinition, if you want to call it that, redefinition of waters of the U.S., which has been basically on hold now? But I would imagine that for this type of an analysis, if that actually did come to be, that would change an awful lot of your assumptions for us.
Well, I don't think so. So a couple things on that. For purposes of the committee that I'm on, we are not at all considering the proposed rule. That's a proposed rule. It's on hold. It's with the courts, and that's outside of what we're dealing with. What's today. But secondly, if that does change, I don't think it changes this, because well, first of all, jurisdiction on its own, as far as waters of the U.S. jurisdiction, that whole issue, that's one of the benefits of assumption. That issue goes away with assumption, because the regulations apply based on state law. They're state regulations that apply, not federal regulations that apply based on waters of the U.S. jurisdiction. So those waters would apply, or those regulations would apply to all, quote, waters of the state, so to speak. It's just so we don't have to adopt the whole issue of determining whether it's a water of the U.S. We just have to make sure that our program covers everything that's a water of the U.S. And it certainly can and does already cover more, with a couple exceptions, which So that issue essentially goes away as far as whether it's water of the U.S. or not.
Maybe you're about to get to that, but I was wondering how you deal with things like state non-regulated incidental wetlands that are sometimes connected that aren't for regulated.
That's one of the things that I think Doug's got on there coming up. I'm sure that's one of those issues that is, it is, maybe it's minor and maybe it's just a small thing, but that does happen where there are, some incidental wetlands that the Corps will regulate.
How do other states that assume responsibility deal with this?
So the only two states that have assumed 404 so far have been Michigan and New Jersey. And both of those states, it's been, well, Michigan did it first, and that was in 80,
Early 80s.
yeah, it was in the 84, I believe. Maybe even earlier than that, I can't recall for sure. And then New Jersey was, several years after that. But it's been over 20 years, well over 20, 25 years or more, even since New Jersey has, I believe. Like I said, I don't remember the exact dates, but what happened then, if you look at the MOA between Michigan and the Corps, it's pretty vague. It essentially restates 404G1, the federal statute that says what's assumable and what's retained, which isn't very clear. And then they have an appendix that identifies the waters. And that appendix, from my understanding, also gets updated fairly regularly. So it doesn't interpret the term adjacent like this. And it does, the state does, from my understanding, assume and regulate some waters that, maybe some would argue they shouldn't, depending on how your interpretation is. Now, New Jersey does it a little different. New Jersey actually draws a 1,000-foot line from certain distances, certain, ordinary high water marks and the high tide or whatever. So they have a little different, a different way of doing it. Now, states that have pursued it since then, like Oregon, Virginia, Alaska, have gotten different answers. Depending on the core district that they're dealing with, they've gotten different answers, and based on what I've heard from staff in those states, they've gotten different answers, and the answers not only would differ amongst them, but it differed from New Jersey and Michigan, what they had. So it just shows that there's a pretty high level of confusion and not a very good level of understanding of how to deal with this right now out there nationally.
So Oregon, Virginia, and Alaska, they haven't finished assuming, or
No.
where are they in the process?
There's only two states that have assumed, and that's Michigan and Jersey. There's several states that have either looked into it or began the process and have spent tons of time and money in pursuing it and still haven't been able to obtain it. So Alaska spent $1 million on pursuing assumption, still haven't gotten assumption. Oregon has spent years and years, I don't remember all the specifics, but years, and they still haven't gotten it. So we actually had someone from Oregon present to our stakeholder group and talk about some of the experiences they had with pursuing assumption. So I mean, it just gets at the need for some clarity from EPA about what can a state assume versus what does the Corps have to retain.
One quick question. It was my understanding that a while ago, when I was doing wetland delineations in Michigan, they used a state wetland delineation methodology that actually differed from the 1987 manual. Have they adopted the 1987 manual now?
As far as I know, they use the 87 manual. I can't imagine, at least now, I can't imagine that there'd be anything different. But
It was like the 93 manual where they assumed a two-parameter test and they
Oh.
assumed hydrology.
well, I don't know. So the point on this anyways, too, is if this is the case, this is just one water. You start adding in, Lake of the Woods, Rainy River, you start working with, particularly in the northeastern part of the state, working your way down, there's not much left to assume. So it doesn't make any sense for Minnesota to even pursue assumption if this was the case. Now, we don't think this is the case, but there are some out there that are saying, yes, this is the case. Again, it doesn't really make a lot of sense logically to use the same test to determine jurisdiction as you would to determine who's going to administer the program Because if you can't administer everything that's jurisdictional, then there's nothing left. So anyways, that's just a little bit of the insight into some of the complications that have to be figured out if we were to pursue the program.
So, one other thing, in terms of, the Corps also has to retain jurisdiction over tribal lands. And so we would not implement the state regulations on tribal lands. There is some question too about what exactly are the tribal lands, and I'm not fully up on that, but nonetheless, the law requires the Corps continue to run Section 404 on tribal lands.
And federal lands as well.
Yeah, federal lands, exactly. So this next element of the study actually gets at this question. What Les was talking about was kind of this whole geographic jurisdiction in terms of what the Corps has to retain jurisdiction over. This next one gets at this issue about the waters of the U.S. and how does the state regulations, what we have, what our regulatory scope is compared to the Clean Water Act. And so a few of the points that we have identified on this is that, first of all, our state regulations when it comes to wetlands are broader than the Clean Water Act. As you probably all know, Clean Water Act does not regulate isolated wetlands. There needs to be some connection to navigable waters, and that's, of course, a little bit up in the air how you define that right now, but there has to be some connection to navigable waters. In Minnesota, between the Public Waters Permit Program and WCA, we regulate all wetlands. So anything that would be identified using the 87 manual is regulated in Minnesota. However, when it comes to other waters, which are also subject to Section 404, there are some gaps. So for example, the Public Waters Permit Program, when it comes to streams, stops at when a stream is has below a 2 square mile drainage threshold. Those by definition are not public waters. There are some of those streams, temporary ephemeral streams that have a bed in the bank, that are connected to downstream navigable waters that would be regulated under Section 404. So if we're going to assume the Section 404 program, we'll have to address that gap in coverage, those headwater stream areas. There are also non-wetland basins. So these are lake-like. They're deep, more than, say, 2 meters deep, more than 10 feet deep. Lake-like basins that are not on the public waters inventory. We're not quite sure how many there are. We're not quite sure why they're out there, but we've identified some that are not on the maps, and we're going to have to analyze that and figure out what the scoop is of that and cover that under our regulations. As Les was pointing out, that the whole issue, though, about whether it's jurisdictional under 404 kind of goes away under state assumption, because, again, the way it works is that you implement a state program, and it has to just meet the minimum under 404. It can regulate more, which ours does, for the most part, with those couple of exceptions. And then you don't have to worry about whether it's jurisdictional under 404. You got a project, you make an application to the state, you don't need to worry about whether it's jurisdictional under Clean Water Act. If you get a state permit, you're good to go as far as 404 under state assumption. So that whole jurisdictional question kind of becomes moot under 404 assumption. All right, the next element of the study that the legislature identified had to do with what are the measures that the state program has to protect aquatic resources compared to Section 404. We think in the Public Waters Permit Program. To some extent, the water quality standards and PDES permits, those are also regulatory programs that enter into the picture, but they're kind of add-on things that are generally piggybacked onto other permits. So they don't have their own permitting, with some exceptions. They don't have their own permitting vehicle. So we talk about those, but for the most part, we're concerned with WCA and Public Waters Permit Program. So for the most part, our programs stack up well when it comes to things like sequencing, avoid, minimize, replace, mitigation, requiring compensatory mitigation, the standards that we have, performance standards. Most of those were developed in conjunction with the St. Paul district anyway, so we're in pretty good shape for most things. Some of the exceptions that we have identified, though, are the Wetland Conservation Act exemptions. Some of the WCA exemptions really do not match up well with Section 404, particularly ones that identify impacts to certain types of wetlands. That, for instance, some of the ag exemptions say that you can drain an unlimited amount of type 1 wetland if it's got a farming history, or up to, 2 to 5 acres of type 2 and type 6 wetlands. And so there's no analog to that under Clean Water Act. Now, there are some ways that you might be able to do those things under general permits and so forth, but some of the WCA exemptions are going to have to be revised, and it's possible some of them will have to be eliminated.
It's not a simple thing as to look at, well, this exemption doesn't apply, we got to get rid of this one. This one's okay. It's there might be a couple that that just doesn't work, or maybe a couple that we can make that, but a lot of them it's we might have to change this part of it, or tweak this, or change the process.
Require notifications
or something like that, and to be able to handle it under some type of like a programmatic general permit. But we don't even know for sure exactly what some of those specifics are, and we wouldn't know until we actually sit down and start negotiating some of that with EPA. So the study isn't going to necessarily identify every specific little thing that has to happen, because at this point we can't. It is going to identify, kind of narrowing in, well, here's where we're going to have some more discussions with EPA to figure out, what we're going to have to do with this. So,
somebody brought up the question about incidental wetlands, and I actually probably should have put that up there, because that is another distinction, is that incidental wetlands, things that were created in upland that weren't intended to be wetlands, are outside the scope of WCA, but they can be regulated under Clean Water Act. So that's another thing that there's some discrepancy there. Consideration of federally listed species under 404. The EPA actually, the responsibility for looking at permits and their impacts on federally listed species passes to EPA. However, from a practical standpoint, the states in both Michigan and New Jersey, they end up doing some screening for impacts of federally listed species. And under state law, we don't have any requirement to look at federally listed species. We look at state listed species, but not federal ones. So that's another piece that we'll probably have to address. There are some differences in the replacement siting sequence. If you're familiar with the Wetland Conservation Act, you know that the preference is you first go on site, then within the minor watershed, and then there's a